start. And so anybody who comes in the next 45 seconds is officially not late. After that, though, we shun them. We're going to talk tonight. This will be the last night that we look at submission. We don't have as much time as I would like to look at all of the different elements that make a family work. One of them is submission. And the reason why it's an important principle is because anytime you get people together, you are not always going to get what you want. I mean, that's just part of human relationships. Anytime there's more than one person, somebody at some point in time is not going to get exactly what they want. And that's just the nature of the relationships that we have with one another. And so when you go to Ephesians 5 and you have that passage in verse 20 where he says, submitting to one another out of the reverence of Christ, you sort of have, it's almost like he makes this statement and there's a colon at the end of it. And then he's going to go through and he's going to tell you what all of that looks like. Interestingly enough, it was pointed out to me last week that submit is a reflexive verb. In other words, it's something that you do. Right? Nobody submits for you, and you can't make somebody submit. Right? You just can't. And the same thing, it shows up that way in your text in Greek, but it's just something you have to do to yourself. God doesn't make you submit. Right? He doesn't force you to do what he wants, because that is not a submission of your will. That is not a willful offering of yourself for something. And so in all of these relationships, interestingly enough, never in any of these relationships that you will see mentioned here in Ephesians 5 and 6, never does it say that the person being submitted to is supposed to go and get submission from the other. Never does it say, masters, go and make sure your slaves submit. Make them submit to you. It never says that. And so this is something that you bring yourself. It's an offering that you give to Christ, and that offering is made manifest in the relationships that you have with other people. And all of that would be nuanced, depending on the situation, depending on the culture, depending on the circumstances that you find yourself in. Because as you go through this, one of the things that is interesting to point out is not all of these things are relationships that God put in place. Right? God did not create the master-slave relationship. That is something that humans created when humans subjugated one another and forced people to become their slaves, made them their property. God did not do that. But God says that the slaves are supposed to submit to their masters. And so there might be circumstances in which we find ourselves that are not specifically mentioned in the text. For example, employment, the way that we think of employment, pretty much did not exist in the first century. Right? There were money that changed hands. You had somebody who was like a proprietor. But really, the modern concept of employers-employees didn't exist. So does that mean that you can say, well, the Bible doesn't tell me to submit as an employee, so I can be mean to my boss, and there's no biblical passage that you can use? Well, no, because these principles then apply to all of the relationships that we see, even though they might be different than what existed in the first century. So I thought what we would do tonight is just run very quickly from the beginning of chapter 5 up to verse 20, look at what it means to submit to one another, why that's a significant statement, and then we talked some about the first one, the man and the woman, so we'll just go over that very quickly, and then we'll look at some of the other elements that are mentioned and see how those things would apply to our lives, in particular in a family unit and to a local faith family, a community of believers. And so if you look at chapter 5 and verse 1, be imitators of God as beloved children. What is significant about that statement? Yeah. And why should you imitate him? Yeah. He's your father. You're his children. And so immediately what you see in the context of everything that is going to be talked about in the rest of chapter 5 and chapter 6, it spawns from, is generated from this idea of God as your father. It's a familial discussion. And so when we start thinking about what does it mean to be part of a family, whether a physical family or a larger spiritual family, all of these things in this section of the text spring from that idea. You are God's child, and since he is your father, this is how you ought to act as one of God's children. And so he's going to go through, and he's going to immediately then mention Jesus, who loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So with that sort of as the backdrop, what do you think submission is going to involve a lot of? Sure, he's our pattern. So we're supposed to be like Jesus, who suffered and who gave of himself for others. And so that is who we are as God's people. We are those who willingly suffer and those who give of ourself for others. I don't know about you, I do not like to suffer. I would rather not sacrifice things. That's just sort of my gut reaction. If things are unpleasant, I would rather not do them. And we, as God's people, are called to be those who do those things whenever it is necessary, whenever it furthers the kingdom, whenever we find ourselves in a situation where my suffering can bring about good for somebody else, then I need to be willing to suffer. I need to be willing to patiently endure hardship for the benefit of other people. See, we like to suffer sometimes when it's for our own benefit. Like, we'll go to school for 13 years so that we can get a high school diploma. What if you went to school for 13 years and at the end of that suffering, right, what if they gave your diploma to somebody else? You went to school for 13 years, congratulations, somebody else now graduates and you get to start over. You could not pay me to go through that process again. I loved going through it the first time because I had some really great educators. I'm not doing it again. And the same thing with college. Same thing with any kind of training that you go through. We wouldn't do that. Right? Well, some of you would because you're lovely people. I wouldn't do that, right? If I had known at the beginning that I wasn't getting the diploma at the end, deal's off. But that's who Christians are. We are called, like Jesus, to suffer for others. And so all through this section, you're going to have this new identity that you are given, and you're going to have this new calling, which is to submit. The opposite of the way that the world works. When Jesus talks about the kingdom, the greatest of you must be the servant of all. And so it's interesting when you start talking about leadership amongst God's people, leaders should be exemplars of the fruit of the Spirit. When you think about somebody who is a leader among God's people, they should be somebody who is kind and patient, who is loving, who is considerate, who's knowledgeable in the scriptures, that is talked about somewhere. They should also be those who are really good at submitting. Do you normally think of leadership in those terms? When you're thinking of somebody who you want to be a leader, do you think of, well, are they really good at submitting to other people? I don't. There are very few things that operate the way that God's kingdom does, that operate in a similar way to God's kingdom. The military doesn't do that. You don't choose a commander to lead the soldiers out into battle who is going to be submitting to the will of all of the soldiers. You don't do that. Right? Typically, the CEO at the business, if you worked for Apple and you went to go talk to Tim Cook and you said, hey, we're going to do this now, he's not going to listen to you because he is the boss and you are not. That's how it works. Among God's people, though, Jesus says the greatest among you will be the servant of all. And he shows himself to be the servant. And so this idea of submission is wed into our identity as God's people. And then in verse 15, chapter 5, look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. Don't be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And then that section in verse 18, we're going to talk about two different spirits, two different mindsets. Do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Different, right? A different way. Making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always for everything to God the Father, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. So this is who we are. Just like we would think, oh, well, Christians are a loving people, or Christians are a generous people, we should also be thinking that Christians are a submitting people. And I don't know if you were to ask somebody to describe me, I don't know if they would use that as an adjective. When I think of Stephen, I think of submission. He's just great at submitting to other people. I don't know that they would necessarily say that I'm a rebellious person either, but maybe I need to work on that. So then I think what you've got here is you have all this information. Here are these things that God's new people look like, that his children look like. And then I think verse 21 should have a colon at the end of it. Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ, colon. And then everything that follows, these different relationships that we're going to see, are sort of like explanations or examples or illustrations of what it looks like for somebody to submit to someone else. When we looked, does that make sense? We're saying that that's sort of like your heading: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Why is it significant that this submission is for reverence to Jesus? Yeah, he's our example. That's exactly right. He did this already. He's not calling you to do anything he didn't. Any other ideas or thoughts? Is it because I'm better than you? Or you're better than me? Is that why I would submit to you? No. Oh, what was that? That's right. That's not submission. And so the idea here is that you, as an equal to somebody, a brother or sister in the family, or you're all God's children, you are willingly putting yourself underneath them. If you're better than me or higher than me, you're already above me, and I don't have to submit to you. Right? There's already a hierarchy. But this idea of submission is like two people meeting together, and I say, you know what, you go first. That's submission. That's sort of the picture here. And we do that not because I am worthy of it or you are worthy of it, but Christ is worthy of it. Yes, it's out of respect for Jesus. So because of who Christ is, we submit ourselves to one another. And then he's going to give you some of the examples. Any other thoughts before we move into some of the specific examples that he gives us? Yes. Yes, Jesus died for all of us, and that makes us all the same. Right? We're not any more important than anybody else. Mhm. Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. The things that he mentions, that he says don't do, are things that are selfish inherently, and they lead you away from this other-oriented attitude. And we are called to be focused on others. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes. Yes. Yeah. The idea that Jesus died for all people broadens our responsibilities so that we have to think in different terms. Like Christ died for the world so that everyone could come to the Father. And we're part of that mission, so to speak. We're part of that effort to go and take the world back from the one from the darkness. Any other thoughts? Feel free at any time if you have thoughts or something that comes to mind, or maybe you're trying to formulate something right now. Whenever it becomes formulated, I don't mind going back. So please, all of us are smarter than any one of us, and so any thoughts or ideas, we want to have that discussion. So getting into the first bullet point, if you want to think of it in those terms, is women. And the reason why we say women is because there is no Greek word for wives. That just doesn't exist. And that's not uncommon in language. And the idea here is to submit to the man that pertains to you. We talked a little bit about this last week. And what it does is it kind of gives you a scope. It broadens things, the umbrella image, which would certainly include wives and the husband relationship, but it doesn't limit it to that. And so the first thing is, in the first century culture, when you come to this and you see this section, where if Paul is saying women always do what the guy says, that's not a shock, right? That would be like the obvious thing. Everybody would agree with that. And so one of the things you have to do is you have to step back for a second and say, well, why in the world would he write something that is already so obvious? Why would he say that? Yeah, the basis for it is different. It's not power. It's not this person is stronger than you physically, socially, monetarily, whatever, politically. It's not based on a power structure, but it is because, again, back to reverence for Jesus. So the entire reason for it is different. One of the things that's interesting about Christianity is it elevates women. It takes them out of where they were, which many times was viewed as property or worse, and it elevates them back to where they ought to always have been. The image of God. In the garden, when the man and the woman are made, both of them are human, and humanity is both of them. It's almost like you don't have humanity until you have both of them, is sort of the idea that you get. And maybe one of the issues is that in this idea of women being lifted up, perhaps some of them thought that released them from the obligations of culture and society. And it could be that Paul has to reinforce that to let them know, hey, yes, we're all equal, but that does not release us from the world that we live in, from the culture that we live in. For example, he's going to talk later to servants, to slaves. You know, we sanitize that. We put the word servants in. Many translations do. It's slaves. Well, if things went back to the garden, which they do for us, right? We're back with God in the garden through Christ. A slave might also say, you know what? I'm a Christian, and I'm no longer bound by the social norms and customs in which I have found myself, and so I'm no longer a slave. And Paul comes and says, actually, no, you are. And you are to submit to your master. And he will have a lot, actually, to say to people who are slaves. And one of the weird things or interesting things in Christianity is you might wind up with a local church where there's maybe a wealthy person who has the church in their house, and then maybe one of the shepherds at that local church might be one of that person's slaves. Talk about an interesting dynamic, right? How does that work? And so the idea here, one of the things that Paul is saying is that Christianity hasn't come thinking of turning the world upside down. It has not come to change every single social custom and social norm. That's not the idea. The idea is to get people back to God. And now as you do that, right, as people come back to God and as people are transformed, cultures and societies will change. We see that in history. Wherever Christianity goes, changes in culture and social norms follow. But Christianity itself is not a social agenda, right? That's not the purpose, is to come and change society. That's really, if you ever hear the phrase social gospel, that doesn't mean eating in the church building. That's not what that means. Social gospel means changing society, like righting all of the social wrongs. That's not what Christianity is. And if there are social wrongs and you want to speak out about them, please, I'm not trying to discourage you from doing that. But the idea, the heart of Christianity is not to change the political structure of any country. The heart of Christianity is to bring us back to God through Christ, to redeem us. And in that redemption, we will be changed. And as people change, that will change the culture around them. And so it's a difficult line to walk, where you're set free, you're all equal, but your culture doesn't recognize that. The place where you live doesn't recognize that. And so in order for you to be a light shining in the darkness, yes, you're free in Christ, but currently you're also a slave to this person. So be the best slave that they have ever had. Yes, it's all rooted in love. Yes. Yep. That's a good point. Where's the focus? And it's kind of this weird, it's a conundrum. It's this oxymoron. You've been set free to be a slave. Right? Jesus, the king of all creation, came to be a servant. And we, being drawn into the family through him, have been set free from the bondage of sin to become bondservants of God. And so there's this tension between who we are and what we see in the world around us and what things will be like when we get to where we're going. And in the meantime, our duty, rooted in love, is to focus on others in every and any way that we can, so that when people think of us, they always think highly of Christ. Because if you are a Christian and you become a horrible servant after you become a Christian, that reflects negatively then on Jesus. I was talking with somebody just this past weekend, and we were talking about Christianity. It turns out he was a very well-known, or he had been a very well-known executive in the business world, and he talked about when he got into meetings with people, he always had a 10-minute presentation on whatever he was talking about, where he talked about vertical relationships and then horizontal relationships. And he made the point, we were talking about how Christianity ought to change who you are, and he made the point that many people who think about Christianity, they get the up and down part right. I have access to God through Jesus. And that it liberates me. It sets me free. And now I'm in fellowship again with God. He said the difficulty is the sideways part, where you're looking out at your other human relationships. And he said sometimes Christians focus so much on the up and down, they forget that there is a side to side also, and they miss the entire cross. And I thought that was interesting, and he drew a cross on the paper. It was a really interesting idea. And so what you're seeing here in this section is the sideways part of the cross. It starts off at the beginning of chapter 5. You're a beloved child of God. That's the up and down. And now this should change you so that your relationship with other people is different. The next, after the wives, and he's going to talk to the men. After the women, he talks to the men. And we talked a little bit about this last week, about how this would be the shocking part. The other part where he says, women, you're to be in subjection to the men that corresponds to you, whether it's a husband, a father, a brother, an uncle, however that worked out. Verse 25 in chapter 5 starts the part that would be truly shocking to somebody in the first century. Husbands, love your wives. Men, love your women. Your daughters, your mothers, anybody who happens to be a female that is connected to you in some way, you are to love them just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. This is contrary to the first century culture. And so you have some agreement and some disagreement. And this really would be something that sets Christianity apart from the rest of the world. And this is going to be the thing. This idea, this concept, is going to be one of the things that ripples through history and changes the way that women get treated. And it should have. It should have. And so this idea that a husband or that a man would love a woman, even to the point of sacrificing himself for her, is not common. It is not a popular idea. And this in the first century is the part that got Christians in trouble. Yes. Yeah. It's much longer because this is the problem. Right? This is what needs to be fixed. Or this is the part that would be shocking. And when Christians go out into the world, they're going to need a really good foundation for this behavior because it is going to be directly contrary to what they see in the culture around them. And it's fathers with their daughters, male slave owners with their female slaves. This idea of any woman that would correspond to a man, he is supposed to love her as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And now you can argue that this might be more in the marriage arena, which is why you have the husbands and wives. I think almost every major translation uses husbands and wives. But that still would keep the same idea of this is the way that any man is supposed to treat anyone that would be seen as under his authority, just like Christ, the head of the church, treats all of those who are under his authority, his body, with love, and he sacrifices himself for them. And then when you look at the other things he does, he sanctifies the church, he makes it holy, he cleanses it, he presents the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or anything, so that the church is holy and blameless. This is entirely focused on other people. And Jesus does this for us because in verse 30, we are members of his body. And then he's going to go all the way back to the very beginning where God made the man and the woman. And one of the interesting things, when New Testament writers refer back to Old Testament passages, Paul isn't just referring to this one verse that he has pulled out of Genesis. The reference back to Genesis, absolutely, it certainly includes this reference when he's writing. It's absolutely going to be from Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. But it's also the entire narrative. Right? When they would reference things, and they expected the entire passage to come back to your mind. And one of the glaring things that would have been jarring to the first century Gentiles is that in the very beginning, when God created humanity, he made them male and female. In the image of God, he made them both. Yes. Right. If you have somebody who loves you like Jesus did, then submitting to them becomes something that's easy. It's not a down-putting thing. And what's interesting is you have a reciprocal relationship here. Where if you're sacrificing yourself for somebody else, putting their good ahead of your good, that's what the word submission means. Placing yourself behind somebody else or underneath somebody else. And so you see that both people are called to do this. And how this works will look different depending on whatever relationship you're talking about. It will look a little bit different depending on which culture you're talking about. But the principles are the same. It is a reciprocal submission where one submits to the other and the other back. And that is this relationship, the beauty of this relationship. And interestingly enough, in the first couple of centuries, as far as we can tell, it's difficult because they don't have a census the way that we think of it, and there were no like roll sheets from the early churches. We don't have those. As far as we can tell, sociologists guess that the makeup of the early church was probably about 60 to 65% women. Why would that be? This. The world tells you that you are worthless, and Christ tells you that you are worthwhile, that you are valuable. And not only are you valuable, but you are made in the image of God. Where if you go back and read the Greek creation myths, if you go back and read other ancient Near Eastern creation myths and the stories of how humanity comes about, none of them elevate women. All of them subjugate women. They make women the problem of everything. Pandora and her box. She's the reason why everything is bad, right? And it gets worse from there, right? And so it's not a good picture. But then when you come and you see the biblical narrative where God says that you are, not only are you human, which is a big step up, not only are you fully human, but you are made in God's image and God gave his son for you. That's a big draw. And so people flocked to that. Women flocked to that. And the result of that, as women come in numbers, who typically comes with the woman? Children. The children. Right? And then if the woman starts going, if the wife starts going and the children start going, then maybe the man is interested and you wind up with what Peter is talking about where, you're going to draw him in through the way that you behave. And so you see, when sociologists go back and they kind of look at the piecemeal information that we have, they're actually kind of putting together the very thing that you're seeing play out in the New Testament text. That it is this great elevation of women that draws them to Christ. And when they come, it draws the children, and then it draws the men, and everybody winds up coming. It's just a very beautiful picture of what happens when these things are put into practice. So then in chapter 6, we talked about that, not chapter 6, but the end of chapter 5. We talked about that a little bit last week. We need to get through the rest of it. So children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. What does that mean? All right, so children, anybody under 12, what do you think is meant by children? I always think it's interesting as we kind of are thinking through what would it mean to be a child. I don't know that Paul has an age in view here. I don't think that he's saying this is applicable until you turn 21. After that, which point, just forget about your parents. I think it's relational, right? You are always the child of your parents. Always. There will never be a day when you are not. And since there is never a day when you are not the child of your parents, you should always obey them in the Lord. Now, it's that in the Lord part that maybe causes us some trouble. Does it mean that you obey your spiritual parents, so the person who taught you the gospel? Maybe you lost your physical family and now you only have your spiritual family. What are the situations? Or in the Lord it can be synonymous to as the Lord. So just like you saw earlier with the women to the men as though to the Lord, that could be what he's saying here. Children, obey your parents as the Lord. So that might help us understand more of what he is saying, for this is right. Jesus, when he chastises the scribes and the Pharisees for their practice of Corban. So Corban, what they would do is particularly if you were wealthy, you would dedicate all of your possessions to the temple. Well, once those possessions are dedicated to the temple, they become holy. And once they are holy, nobody can use them. But since there's always a since you were so kind to donate everything that you own to the temple, we will allow you sole use of it until which time it becomes the possession of the temple, which unfortunately means you can't share it and you can't give any of it away and you can't sell it. Well, once you have done that, then your parents come to you in their old age and they're no longer able to work or whatever the situation is. Maybe they just need some food and they come to you and they're like, I need help. At which point you would say, I'm sorry. I have given all of my things to the temple. I cannot help you. That seems pretty rotten. And it was. And that's what they were doing. And they were doing it so that they did not have to support their parents. What terrible people. But that I'm sorry, that's kind of judgmental. But I have 8 children so that I will have retirement. That's why there are 8 children, right? And so that was sort of the idea, that children were a heritage from the Lord, that the people in your family are supposed to band together and take care of one another, and they were subverting that idea of honoring your father and mother, which Paul brings up here. Honor your father and mother, the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you in the land. That's what the world does. The inward-looking focus is going to make sure that I have mine, and if you don't have yours, you should have worked harder. Right? But the outward focus, especially to those who cared for you and brought you up, whether it's biological mother and father, grandparents, adoptive family, however you wound up in a family, somebody cared for you, and you should love them back. And that's sort of the idea there in the beginning. Children, you need to remember this relationship, and you need to always be willing to be submissive to your parents. You'll see this still in a lot of Eastern cultures, where the children are always very careful to be respectful towards their parents. In Indian families, it is not uncommon for grandparents to come and live with the 2 people who get married, so that the grandparents don't have to worry about supporting themselves. They take care of them. And so I don't know what everybody's familial arrangements look like, but the idea here is that you never stop caring for the people who are in your family. Never. And so the children, obey your parents. Now, does that mean they get to pick out which clothes you wear when you're 35? I don't know. Maybe. I will tell you that I always cut my hair the way my father liked it, even after I left the house. Fathers, the opposite here now. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Again, here's the shocking part. I think did we talk last week that a Roman man could kill his son until he was like 16 or 17, at which point he became kind of human, and he became a full man around the age of 25. That doesn't fit in this picture here. You don't get to provoke your children to anger. Right? Yeah. And when you look at history, that bears out. Like in history, it is the one who tends to be in power that really needs to kind of be brought back. Like we don't do well being in control. Humans don't. And in the first century, it would be the father who is in absolute control of the family. And so when Paul is sort of correcting these things, saying, hey, you need to change the way that you're living, it is to that person in power, the man, the father, that he would speak. It was the father who made the decision about which children lived and which children didn't. And so he speaks directly to him. You need to be careful how you treat your children, and you need to bring them up. But that is a very significant phrase that maybe doesn't ring in our ears as much as it would have to these people. You do not get to dispose of the children you don't want. You have to bring them up. And you do this in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So you now are going to become their model, just like Christ is our model, and just like God is the one that we're called to imitate. You bring them up. And Christians become known not only for rearing their own children, but also for being incredibly involved in what we today would call adoption. They just called it saving people's lives in the first century, second and third century. There were people who would get up every day and they would walk around the roads outside of town, and they would be looking for infants that had been left exposed. There were Christians who would go to expectant parents, and they would tell the expectant parents, if your child is a girl, we'll take her. so that you don't have to expose the child. And it's such a radically different way in the first century of thinking about life. These Christians were dedicated not just to saving the lives of children, but then to bringing them up. And so in a very real sense, again, sort of what we alluded to earlier, is the fact that Christians started to get this idea of family, right? That we're all together connected, was one of the reasons why the church grew. Because Roman families tended to stay fairly small. Christian families tended to be very large. Because if you needed a home, ours is open. And when you come in, we're going to love you and care for you and treat you the way that you ought to be treated. And we're going to give you everything that is ours. And it was a place where people wanted to be. The next section, unless there's any other thoughts about that, the parents and the children. Yeah. Yeah. All right, so then bondservants. Most people's translation probably says something like bondservants or servants. It's the word for slave. We don't like to use that word. But bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, and not by the way of eye service or as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. And so here is the lowest in as far as society is concerned. And most of us, if we were alive in the first century, would find ourselves under some form of slavery. We always think back, like if I imagine myself living in the first century, I'm always like a Roman senator, right? Or somebody, to do. Chances are that wouldn't be the case. In Rome, it was something like 60% or more of the population were slaves. And much more of that population, probably even smaller, maybe to like 20%, 15% were actually free. Others were bonded in some way. You go over to Greece, Sparta, 1 in 10 people in Sparta were free. The helots, the slaves for the Spartans, outnumbered them 10 to 1. And so most people in the ancient world were some kind of slave. You were owned or in bondage to somebody. And here Paul says, obey that master. And it's interesting that he says earthly master. Obviously, we have God who is our heavenly master. But there's this idea that he doesn't say spiritual or some other word, or he doesn't just say master, but this idea of earthy, this fleshly, the master of this dirt. Obey them. They're going to be many times contrary to God's will. They're not going to behave the way that they should. They're not going to be doing the things that they should, but that does not exempt you from your role as their servant. In fact, he sort of doubles down with fear and trembling and with a sincere heart, obey them just like you would Christ. Not so that people see you, not so that you make other people happy, but again, out of reverence for Christ. And so it's very opposite. Right? If somebody mistreats us, we want to rebel. The idea that somebody could own us, we do not like that. And here, instead of saying, break away, go run, become free, he will in another place say, if you can get your freedom, by all means do so. But here, the way that you show your reverence to Christ is by becoming the best servant that you can be for your master. Why is that important? Yeah. We actually have this idea of bringing back reverence for Christ. There are actually some reports of masters who were so impressed with their Christian slaves that they forced Christianity upon the others so that they would become. So it's kind of funny. But that's what you're seeing here is when people see the fundamentally altered humanity that God has called us to, they like it. They may not want to become a Christian themselves, but they can't say, oh, this is bad. Right? And so it's just interesting that people throughout history have seen who Christians are, even if they didn't want to be a Christian themselves. They have seen who Christians are and they wanted it. And so this idea, today we might talk about employment. If you work for somebody, be the best possible employee you can be. Work hard, work diligently, not so that you get a promotion, but because you have been employed, so work hard. And again, he turns it around. Masters, do the same. And again, this really is sort of the part that's like, what? This doesn't make sense. Do the same to them. Stop threatening them, knowing that you have a master in heaven and that there is no partiality with your master. And so this idea, in each one of these relationships, the idea is that you're both equal. The slave submits to the master and the master submits to the slave. The child submits to the parent submits to the child. The man submits to the woman and the woman submits to the man. There's this submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And the same thing is true in every relationship that's mentioned here. It's true in a local church, where the way that you have harmony and peace is when everyone submits one to another out of reverence for Christ. We're out of time. There's a lot more we could talk about, but it'll come up, I'm sure, as we continue looking at other elements of what it means to be a family. Thank you so much for your comments and for your time this evening.